The auctioneer looked at me when I raised my hand. Not the way he looks at everyone who bids, a different look. A look that said, "Son, are you sure you know what you're doing?" I was sure. I'd walked that ground 3 times before the auction. I knew exactly what I was buying. 800 acres of West Texas caliche hardpan, the kind of ground that breaks equipment and discourages men, sitting 20 miles east of Midland in the middle of nowhere important. The bidding had stalled at $160 an acre because everybody in that room had already decided what the land was worth. I took it to $200 and nobody followed me. $200 an acre. That's $160. 0 for 800 acres of ground that looked, from the surface, like someone had paved it with a dull gray concrete that went 3 feet deep. The man next to me, a cotton farmer named Herb Donnelly, who'd been working this part of Texas since before I was born, leaned over after the gavel fell and said, "Boy, what do you think you just bought?" I said. "The best investment in Midland County." He laughed. Not mean. Just the laugh of a man who has seen optimism get beat out of people by West Texas soil before. 3 years later, Herb Donnelly knocked on my door and asked if I'd sell him 200 acres of that ground. I said, "It's not for sale, Herb. My name is Travis Bledsoe. I've been farming and ranching in the Permian Basin for 22 years. This is the story of 800 acres of ground everyone wrote off. One Caterpillar D9 with a ripper attachment. And what happens when you refuse to accept what the surface is telling you? Let me tell you about caliche first, because if you didn't grow up in the Southwest, you might not know what you're dealing with, and what you're dealing with matters a great deal to this story. Caliche is a sedimentary rock layer, technically a calcic horizon, formed over thousands of years when calcium carbonate leached downward through the soil profile and precipitated out as the water evaporated. In West Texas, where annual rainfall is around 14 inches, and the evaporation rate is about 4 times that, the caliche layer is often continuous, dense, and anywhere from 6 inches to 5 feet thick, sitting anywhere from 6 inches to 2 feet below the surface. It's not quite concrete, and it's not quite limestone. It's something in between, and it behaves differently than either one, depending on moisture and temperature. In dry conditions, which is most of the time in the Permian Basin, a good caliche layer will stop a standard subsoiler cold, will snap off ripper points, will laugh at anything less than serious iron. On my 800 acres, the caliche layer ran at an average depth of 14 inches, with a consistent thickness of about 22 inches. That's 14 inches of topsoil above a 22-inch rock layer. And below that rock layer was something nobody in Midland County wanted to talk about because they'd never gotten through the rock to see it. A deep, sandy loam subsoil with excellent water-holding capacity, sitting on top of an aquifer that nobody had bothered to tap because nobody had bothered to break through the hardpan to get there. The soil profile below the caliche was, in places, better than the soil above it. The caliche was a door nobody had opened because they didn't have the key. I had the key. I just had to get it built. The machine I brought in was a Caterpillar D9T. That's Cat's heavy production dozer, a 410 horsepower machine with a C18 ACRT engine producing 1,819 pound-feet of torque, operating weight of 110,000 pounds. The D9T is not a finish grading machine. It is a machine you bring in when you need to move something that does not want to be moved. I fitted it with a multi-shank ripper attachment, a 3-shank unit with custom carbide-tipped ripper points designed specifically for hard sedimentary rock. The points were rated for West Texas caliche by the manufacturer, which is about as specific a product recommendation as you'll find in the equipment world. The contractor who operated the D9T was a man named Olin Cates, who has been ripping caliche in the Permian Basin for 31 years. He drove out to the property the week before we started, walked a couple of transects across the field, pushed a hardness probe into the surface in about a dozen places, and stood at the edge of the property for a while looking at it the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. Then he said, "The layer's consistent. That's good. Inconsistent caliche is harder to work because the machine loads and unloads unevenly, and you break more points. Consistent hardpan loads the machine steady and you can find a rhythm, he said. We'll need to make 2 passes, a ripping pass, then a cross-ripping pass 90 degrees to the first, to fully break the matrix, I said. How long? He said. 3 weeks if nothing goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. If you've ever put a machine into ground that everyone else decided was a lost cause and felt it finds something worth fighting for, subscribe right now. Because what happened over those 3 weeks, and what came out of the ground when it was over, changed what I thought I knew about West Texas soil. And if you stay with me through the numbers at the end, I think it'll change what you think you know too. The first pass started on a Monday morning in late February. Olin ran the D9T at about 2.5 miles per hour in first gear, the 3 ripper shanks set to a depth of 36 inches, through the topsoil, through the caliche layer, and 18 inches into the subsoil below. The sound that machine made going through that caliche is something I still think about. Not a grinding sound, not a screaming sound, a cracking, a deep periodic cracking, like ice breaking on a river, except underground, transmitted up through the ground into the soles of your boots if you were standing within 50 yards of the machine. Each time a ripper shank hit a section of consolidated caliche and broke through it, you felt it. The D9T's engine load was running at 88 to 92% through most of the pass. That's 410 horsepower working at near capacity, 819 pound-feet of torque applied to 3 steel shanks going through ancient rock. The exhaust stack ran gray to black on the hard sections and cleared to lighter smoke when the machine found easier ground. I watched that exhaust stack the way you watch a gauge. When it went dark, I knew the machine was earning its hourly rate. The ripper points lasted an average of about 40 acres per set. I had budgeted for 12 sets. We used 15. On 3 occasions, a shank hit a particularly hard nodule in the caliche, what Olin called a calcrete concretion, a dense inclusion harder than the surrounding layer, and the point snapped entirely, leaving the metal stump buried in the ground. We'd have to stop, raise the shank, back the machine off the broken point, dig it out with a skid steer, and reset with a new point. Each point replacement cost about 45 minutes plus the cost of the point, 15 sets of 3 points. At $85 per point, that's $3,825 in ripper points alone, on a $200 per acre investment. Those are the costs that make accountants uncomfortable and make farmers laugh, because you don't get the ground without paying for the ground. By the end of week 1, we had ripped about 260 acres in the first pass direction. The broken caliche behind the machine was something to see. The surface, which had been a flat, uniform gray hardpan, was now a rough, shattered, upheaved terrain, chunks of caliche, the size of microwave ovens, pushed up and mixed with the sandy topsoil, the whole surface looking like a field that had survived a geological argument. My neighbor Herb Donnelly drove by on day 3 and called me from the road. He said, "Travis, your field looks like a bomb went off in it." I said, "That's about right." He said, "You're not serious about farming that." I said, "I am." He went quiet for a second. Then he said, "I'll check back in a month." Week 2, we started the cross-ripping pass. This is the second direction, running the ripper shanks perpendicular to the first pass grooves, breaking up any remaining continuous sections of the caliche layer and creating a more complete fracture pattern. The cross-ripping was harder work because the first pass grooves had already destabilized the surface and the D9T was working on broken material, which meant the tracks were climbing and descending over the rough terrain of the first pass, while simultaneously running the ripper through the remaining intact sections. The machine's pitch and roll was more extreme. Olin slowed down to 2 miles per hour on the cross pass, and the engine load climbed to 94% on the hard sections. We broke 3 shanks during cross-ripping. Not the points, the shanks themselves. 2 of them were clean breaks at the mounting point, which the manufacturer acknowledged was a known failure mode in very hard material under lateral loading. The third was a crack that developed over about 4 hours of work before it let go entirely. When a shank breaks, you know it immediately. The engine load drops suddenly, the machine rides differently, and the ground behind you stops showing the distinctive ridge pattern that a working shank creates. Shank replacements were $340 each, and each one cost us most of a day. That was a setback I hadn't fully budgeted for. By the end of week 2, I was looking at a total project cost running about $34,000 over my initial estimate. I drove out to the middle of the property one evening, parked my truck, and walked the broken ground for about 20 minutes. The caliche layer was fractured everywhere my boots landed. I dug down with a tile spade in a few places, checking the depth of the fracture below surface. In the best spots, I could push the blade 40 inches into what had been impenetrable rock 2 weeks earlier. Below the fractured caliche, the soil was loose, sandy, orange-brown, subsoil that hadn't seen light or air in probably 10,000 years. I picked up a handful and pressed it. It held moisture, in West Texas, in February. I went home and told my wife we needed to add $34,000 to the operating line. The final week was dozer work, using the D9T's blade to work the broken caliche chunks back into the soil profile, mixing and incorporating rather than burying or removing. This is the part of caliche reclamation that separates people who've done it from people who've read about it. You don't haul the broken rock off. You mix it in. Caliche, once broken, weathers into calcium carbonate particles that improve soil pH, increase soil aggregation, and actually contribute to fertility over time. You're not removing the obstacle, you're converting it. 4 passes with the blade at different angles, working the material down. The result is a rough but workable surface with the old caliche distributed through the top 30 inches of the profile. Then a land plane pass to bring it back to grade. Then deep till with a DMI ripper to create a consistent seed bed at 18 inches. Then a cover crop, sorghum Sudan and cowpeas, broadcast at 25 pounds per acre to start building biology in a soil that had essentially none. 3 weeks of machine work had opened a door. The cover crop was the first knock on it. The cover crop came up in 6 days. That sounds like a small thing. In a soil with essentially no biological activity, no microbial diversity, no organic matter to speak of. Nothing but broken rock and raw subsoil. 6 days to emergence means the physical conditions were right, even if the biology wasn't there yet. Sorghum Sudan is a tough, demanding plant, and it does not apologize for asking a lot from the soil it's in. The fact that it germinated and pushed through on schedule told me that the drainage was working, the pore structure was there, and the root zone was accessible in a way it had never been through that caliche layer. By midsummer, the cover crop was chest-high and green in a field that had been gray hardpan 4 months earlier. Herb Donnelly drove by and called me again. He said, "That's not possible." I said, "Herb, come out and feel the soil." He didn't come out. He wasn't ready to believe it yet. I planted cotton the following spring. Deltapine 1646 B2XF, a Roundup Ready Flex variety bred for the Permian Basin, planted at 3 seed per foot, with a John Deere Max-Emerge variable rate planter calibrated for the lighter textured soil. The first emergence was thin in the northeast corner, where the caliche fracture hadn't fully incorporated, but across 700 of the 800 acres, the stand came up the way you want cotton to come up in West Texas. 2 leaves, then 4, then the plant hitting first square ahead of schedule. Herb Donnelly drove by in July. He called me from his truck the same way he'd been calling me from his truck since February. He said, "Travis, that is cotton on your place." I said, "It is." He said, "What's it going to make?" I said, "Come out and look at the bolls and tell me what you think." He came. He walked 3 rows. He picked a boll and opened it in his hand and looked at the fiber length. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Who's your gin?" I said, "Midland County Co-op." He said, "They're going to see your name on the ticket and not believe it." The gin ticket came back at 892 pounds of lint per acre. For reference, the Permian Basin average for that year was 762 pounds. I was 130 pounds per acre above the county average on ground that sold at $200 an acre because nobody believed it could grow anything. At the lint price that fall, that 130 pound per acre premium on 800 acres was worth about $156,000 of additional revenue above what the average producer was making on comparable priced ground. Herb knocked on my door in October. He sat at my kitchen table and asked what I would take for 200 acres on the East End. I told him it wasn't for sale. He asked why. I said, because I haven't finished what I started with it yet, and I don't sell ground I'm still learning from. He nodded. He said, what you did out there, did you know it was going to work? I said, I knew the soil below the caliche was good. I knew it had moisture-holding capacity that the surface didn't suggest. And I knew that a D9T with carbide ripper points was the right argument to make to that hardpan. He was quiet for a bit. Then he said, I laughed at you at that auction. I said, I know, Herb. He said, I shouldn't have. I said, you had no way of knowing what was under there. Neither did I for certain. I just trusted the data more than the surface. That's the whole lesson. Don't let the surface write the story for you. In West Texas, in Iowa, in Louisiana, wherever you are, the surface is just the cover. The real information is underground. The question is whether you've got the machine and the patience and the willingness to spend the money to read it. $200 an acre. Best investment I ever made. Subscribe if you've ever bet on something everyone else counted out. Tell me in the comments about the ground you're working that doesn't get the credit it deserves. See you in the field.